All right, get ready to jump into the past. Today, we're heading all the way back to ancient Rome and China.
Wow, ambitious.
Yeah, but get this. We're going to be looking at same-sex relationships.
Interesting.
We have these incredible excerpts from some academic research,
Okay.
and they compare and contrast how both these totally different ancient cultures viewed these relationships. I'm really excited about this.
Me too. It's amazing,
Right.
amazing how much we, even today, like to put our modern ideas onto the past.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
This deep dive, it's going to help us go way beyond just assuming things to see what was really going on. I think we're going to find some surprises.
I think so too. I am ready to dive in. Let's start with ancient Rome. Okay, so we think of ancient Rome, it's like this very structured, kind of strict society, right?
Yeah,
But the research, it says something pretty shocking. Same-sex relationships, they were kind of common, especially if you were like a big deal.
that's true. Though the text really emphasizes that for the Romans, it wasn't about sexual orientation the way we think of it now.
So it's not about like who you love,
Yeah. It was more about your role in society.
so where you fit in.
Exactly, exactly. And power. The Romans, they were all about who had the power in a relationship.
So like, were there specific terms for that or?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay,
It was like active and passive partners. And it really mattered who was who.
I see. So who was dominant and?
Right. And the active partner, the
Yeah.
dominant one, usually the one higher up on the social ladder, that was okay. But the passive partner, uh-oh, not so much.
Interesting. Would they have had specific words, like labels for all of this, or was it more of just an
Or
understanding?
they had terms. And it all tied in with ideas of masculinity and being honorable.
Yeah. For a Roman man to be seen as the passive one, I imagine that could be really dangerous for him.
Yeah, it was seen as a threat to his manhood.
That's a big deal.
It was a big deal. Huge deal. Could even get you in trouble legally.
So we're talking about a social structure that could really make things tricky,
Yeah.
especially for people who weren't already powerful.
Right. And all this gets even more, intense when we look at some of the emperors. Let's talk about defying expectations.
Let's talk about Emperor Nero. I mean, he was controversial.
To say the least.
Right. He had these quote-unquote marriages to men, Sporus and Pythagoras. But Sporus, Nero went like all out. He had Sporus castrated
Yeah.
so that he looked more like Nero's dead wife.
I know. It's wild, right? But the text makes a really interesting point. They say Nero's behavior, yeah, it was extreme. But it shows us how power, real power, can turn social norms upside down.
So like he was above it all.
He was emperor. Above it all, could do basically whatever he wanted. Normal people, not so much.
He was almost like twisting those expectations on purpose.
Yeah, yeah. And he didn't stop with just Sporus. He, quote unquote, married Pythagoras, too.
Wow.
But in that marriage, Nero, he was the bride. The sources, they don't hold back on the details. They paint Nero as someone who loved to break the rules.
It's like he was trying to shock everyone.
It's possible. And you have to imagine how people reacted. Fascinated, grossed out, scared of him.
Because he could do whatever he wanted.
Exactly. He had the power. And, it's not just Nero. We've got Emperor Elagabalus, too, about 100 years later. He took things even further.
He did. Not just relationships with men, but he said that he wanted to transition from male to female.
Can you imagine that in ancient Rome? Completely unheard of.
Absolutely unheard of.
The research talks about Elagabalus as this, super controversial figure.
More than Nero?
Oh, yeah, way more. Elagabalus, he was obsessed with messing with Roman ideas of gender, sexuality, all of it. Had a big-time relationship with a charioteer named Heracles.
Oh, okay.
And Elagabalus even tried to make Heracles his quote-unquote husband.
Oh, wow. The Senate must have freaked out.
Oh, it was a total scandal. But Elagabalus, he didn't care. He even offered tons of money to any doctor who could do a sex change on him.
He was serious.
Oh, yeah, he was way ahead of his time. Really sad that he was killed so young.
That is sad. It makes you wonder what could have happened.
What if he'd lived longer? Would things have changed?
Right. We're seeing, I think, a really complex picture of ancient Rome.
Definitely.
They had same-sex relationships, but it was all about power, social status, and very specific rules about what men could and couldn't do.
Exactly. Nero and Elagabalus, they show how those rules could be bent, broken, even if you were strong enough, powerful enough. But now, let's switch gears completely.
Okay.
Let's go east to ancient China. Totally different approach. Think elegant metaphors and subtle hints, not like the Romans who were very out there with it.
I love that. I've always been fascinated by how ancient Chinese culture used metaphors to talk about complicated ideas.
It's really remarkable, isn't it? And when we look at same-sex relationships, they created some stunning imagery to express these connections.
Like the passions of the cut sleeve.
Yes, a
Okay.
classic example. It comes from Emperor A of Han and his lover, Dong Xian.
Okay.
The story goes that Dong Xian fell asleep on the emperor's sleeve, and to not wake him up, the emperor cut the sleeve off his robe. It became this lasting symbol of love and sacrifice between two men.
So that's romantic. Who would do that today?
Right. Maybe not the sleeve cutting, but the feeling. It's timeless. And then there's the bitten peach metaphor. Goes way back to the Warring States period. Duke Ling of Wei and his courtier, Mitsijie.
Oh, I remember that one. It's such a sweet story.
Isn't it? Mitsijie, he was eating this delicious peach, offers the rest of it, the bitten part, to the Duke, and the Duke loved that. So it became this kind of code for same-sex love in their culture.
These metaphors, they're subtle. You don't just come out and say it.
Yeah.
It's not like the Romans at all. I mean, they were very direct,
Yeah.
confrontational even.
Yeah, very different. The Chinese, they valued being discreet, especially about matters of the heart.
So, okay, metaphors.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that, right? I mean, didn't emperors and nobles in China have relationships with both men and women?
Absolutely. Formal same-sex marriage, that wasn't really a thing in China. But those relationships, they were often accepted, especially amongst the elite, as long as it didn't mess with their family duties.
So they had to keep those two worlds separate.
Exactly. Keep things balanced. Personal desires over here, societal expectations over there. So you could have these relationships, but you still had your heterosexual marriage to, carry on the family line.
It is amazing. Two totally different cultures on opposite sides of the world dealing with this aspect of life in such different ways.
Right. It shows us that there's no one way to be human. And we need to be careful about judging the past.
For sure. All of this is making me think about everything I thought I knew about ancient Rome and China.
Oh, good.
I'm ready to keep digging into these differences. I bet we'll find even more.
I think you're right.
I have a feeling.
It really is like a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah,
Each culture, it's like a new piece.
it is.
Yeah.
And human history, it's so much more, interesting than we think.
It really is. Oh, and one thing the text mentions,
Yeah.
it talks about how Rome and China were actually connected.
Oh, really?
Yeah, through trade route, like the Silk Road, there was some exchange happening.
So those two empires, like ideas and stuff, could travel between them.
Yeah. Although how much influence they had on each other. Historians still debate that.
It makes you wonder if there was, some person who actually went from Rome to China. Or the other way around.
Right. What a story that would be. But even without those individual stories, we can still see some pretty cool similarities. And some big differences.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about those differences. When it comes to same-sex relationships, what stands out as the biggest contrast between the Romans and the Chinese?
Well, we've talked about it a little bit, but Roman emperors, they were a lot more open about their relationships with men, even if it caused a big scandal. They weren't afraid to push the limits.
Nero and Elagabalus, they come to mind.
Totally. They were almost trying to provoke people, weren't they?
It seems like it.
The text suggests that it might be because the Romans, they were really into individual power.
Oh, what?
Emperors, they were supposed to be these huge personalities who weren't afraid to break the rules to show how dominant they were.
So for an emperor, being with a man, it was almost like another way to show power, even if it went against what society thought.
That's one way to look at it. And it's totally different from China. China, it was all about discretion, keeping things quiet, maintaining that social harmony.
It's like those metaphors we talked about, the cut sleeve, bitten peach, it's all hidden meanings.
Exactly. It's not out in the open.
Yeah.
And the text, it argues that this came from Confucian values, family, social order, respecting tradition.
So same-sex relationships, they could happen, but they had to stay within the lines.
Yeah. And it's so interesting how this shows up in the texts we're looking at.
Oh, how so?
The Roman texts. They're way more detailed, almost like they want to shock you with the description.
Yeah, those stories about Nero, pretty graphic.
Right. But the Chinese texts, they're elusive, metaphorical.
Yeah.
Like they want you to figure out what's really going on.
Like a secret code.
Exactly. You need to read between the lines, understand their culture to really get it. That's what makes studying these different cultures so interesting.
Okay, so lots of differences. But what about similarities? Were there any things both the Romans and the Chinese had in common when it came to same-sex relationships?
There's one big similarity. In both cultures, if you were one of the elite, having a same-sex relationship was more accepted.
That's true. We've been mostly talking about emperors and nobles.
Mhm.
What about everyday people? What does the research say about them?
Sadly, we don't have a lot of details about ordinary people back then, but the text, it suggests that same-sex relationships were happening in all levels of society. It just wasn't recorded as much.
It makes you think maybe there were ways they expressed these relationships that we just don't know about.
Yeah, rituals, practices that were never written down. It's possible. Remember, history, it's often told from the point of view of those in power. The voices of the less powerful, they often get lost.
That's a good point. Makes you realize we need to be careful about how we interpret history.
Absolutely. We only have so much to go on. But even with that, what's clear is both Romans and Chinese, they had their own complicated ways of dealing with same-sex relationships. They just went about it in very different ways.
Like each one was trying to figure out how to fit those relationships into their own rules.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what I find so cool about this. We're not just learning dry facts. We're like getting into the human stories behind them.
And those stories, they can be really surprising.
Definitely. And, I think this deep dive has brought up some important questions about how we see LGBTQ plus identities and rights today.
I agree. Looking at ancient Rome and China has really changed how I think about the history of same-sex relationships. But how can we use this historical knowledge to understand LGBTQ plus issues today?
Well, one thing it does is it shows us that same-sex relationships are not new.
Right, this wasn't invented recently.
Exactly. It's been around for centuries and in so many different cultures. And knowing that, it can be really powerful for LGBTQ plus people. It tells them their identities aren't like strange or made up.
It's like saying, we've always been here, you just didn't see us.
Yeah, exactly. And it shows that fighting for LGBTQ plus rights, it's not some radical new thing. It's part of a really long history. And the way societies have dealt with same-sex relationships, it's always been changing.
So it's not about making new rights. It's about getting back rights that were taken away.
That's a great way to put it. I think knowing this history can also help people understand each other better, different generations, different communities.
Yeah, it's like we're connecting their stories to ours.
I like that. And we have to remember that the fight for LGBTQ plus rights, it's not over.
In a lot of places, it's still really hard.
Yeah. That's why this history, it's so important. It shows us this fight. It's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, not just something that started recently.
Exactly. It's been happening in different ways, sometimes quiet resistance, sometimes big challenges to how things are.
Yeah, like those ripples you get when you throw a stone in water.
I see what you mean.
Every time someone stands up, even if it's small, it can make a difference.
And sometimes those ripples, they turn into waves that change everything, like the Stonewall riots.
Oh, yeah.
People think of that as like the start of the modern LGBTQ plus rights movement.
It started with people fighting back against the police.
Right. And it became this huge movement for equality all over the world.
It shows you never know what's going to spark change.
Right. It's not always planned. Sometimes it's just people saying enough is enough.
There's that quote, something like, evil wins when good people do nothing.
That's a powerful one.
Yeah, staying silent. It's like you're agreeing with what's happening, especially when we're talking about human rights.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive, it's not just about looking back. It's about what we do now.
We can learn from the past.
We have to. It's not enough to just know these struggles happen. We have to understand how they affect us today.
And I think part of that is realizing that LGBTQ plus rights, they're connected to all sorts of other fights for justice.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about fighting all kinds of discrimination, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, religion, anything that divides people.
It's about remembering we're all human.
Yeah, and building a world that's fair for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So I hope as we wrap up this deep dive into ancient Rome and China, that you're feeling curious,
Yeah.
like you want to learn more, and that you're ready to keep fighting for what's right, whatever that looks like for you.
History isn't just about what happened before. It's alive. It shapes who we are.
So keep diving deep, stay curious, and always question everything. Thanks for listening.